haven't printed it out, maybe you want to pull it up on your screen. It was 12:46 p.m. August 11th, and the title of it was DRO Topics. And this is kind of the way we're going to kind of organize ourselves tonight. Also, Amanda sent out a spreadsheet. She ran through the DRO and saw a couple of things that I thought will be very helpful to us. So she put a nice spreadsheet together. And I thought Tom and Amanda could just run through those at the end of going through Tom's spreadsheet. And so Amanda also has some information for us on breweries. She can give us a little bit of a perspective on what other cities have been doing with regard to that. So that's nice to have that research. And then I also happen to have the DRO up from the city website on my screen here somewhere as well. I thought I did. Well, wherever it went, maybe it's gone. Anyway, might pull that up just to see. Did everybody get the email from Chris that had Amanda's attachment to it? It's a spreadsheet, kind of like this. It's an Excel spreadsheet. Those are the two things that we're going to use tonight. So I don't see John yet. Chris, should we go ahead and get started, you think? Chris Nicola up there.
Yeah, we could call the roll and start if you'd like, Mr. Chairman.
All right, well, I have to call the meeting to order first because I have to use this thing.
Bill Tenderly.
Yes, all right. Okay, watch out. All right, there we go. We'll call the meeting to order tonight and read this. Okay. Adequate notice of this meeting has been posted by the board in preparation of the 2020 annual meeting notice, which sets forth the date, time, and place of this meeting. And by properly posting such meeting and forwarding the notice to those designated newspapers and persons requesting meeting notices. Moreover, in order to comply with the national and state declarations of emergency related to the COVID-19 pandemic and in accordance with the municipal land use law, the Open Public Meetings Act, and the recent operational documents from the Department of Community Affairs, this meeting is being held virtually as a web-based platform with remote public access. Okay, and I've got the flag in the background there from City Hall, so we'll do our Pledge of Allegiance and start from here. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, so we'll do a roll call there, Chris.
Sure. Chairman Anderson,
Present.
Vice Chairman Brinkerhoff,
Present.
Councilmember Little,
Present.
Ms. Paulson Alvarez,
Here.
Mr. Drummond.
I'm mute.
Yeah, you're on mute, Mr. Drummond.
Gregory, hello. Maybe he stepped away from
Here.
Oh, hi.
There we go.
Here.
Great.
Okay, Ms. McNeil,
Here.
Mr. Zucker. We do not see him yet. Mr. Perella,
Here.
Mr. Fiore,
Here.
Mr. Formicelli,
Here.
and for the record, Ms. Wolf is here, subbing in for our Board Attorney, Steve Warner.
And Mr. Delory is also present.
I missed you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, and so as is Krista also, of course.
Hello.
Hi, Krista.
Thank you,
Hi.
Matt.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. If you could either have the memo that Tom sent out or have it up on your screen. What I'd like to do is to skip the first 4 items on it. The ORC, we need to go back to Environmental Commission, Historic Preservation Commission request for preparation of development process is something we'll probably will postpone to the future because we need to run that through the administration and perhaps through the council. And then, of course, with historic preservation, we have yet to tackle that ordinance, which we will do hopefully shortly after the DRO is finished up. So we'll put 1 through 4 on whole breweries we're going to come back to. So the 2 ones that will take some time tonight really are the ORC and the breweries. So we thought we would begin with item number 5 called Capital Improvement Project Review. Now that is something that we've never done. I've only been on the board for about a dozen years roughly and have never been done before. So this afternoon in a call with Steve and Tom and Amanda, we were trying to figure out where this came from. And as best we can tell, and in terms of the experience of both Tom and Steve, they have not worked with a municipality that has done this in New Jersey. And Amanda, you sent out a little bit of an email. Maybe you could give us just a little overview on the research that you were able to do on this point.
I did.
And also, and I'm sorry, and also, Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Sure.
Krista, Chris and I also met and may have some information to share as well.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Thanks. All right.
Yep.
So Amanda, give us some legal background here.
The legal background that I can give you is that the planning board is only able to do that if we are authorized by the governing body. I haven't had a chance to check through the entire ordinance other than the DRO to see if we have that authorization, but I'm hoping maybe Matt will have some details.
All right, Matt and Krista. Thanks, Amanda.
Well, just maybe to go a little bit along that, Krista, if you don't mind, is that the land use law says that planning boards may do this.
Right.
But in discussing as staff members, we did feel it would be slightly unusual that the planning board would make recommendations for a capital program. So we're not really aware of any authority at the moment that the governing body has given to the planning board to actually, as a command, to go and do that. It's just, I think this may have been born out of the land use law where it says we may do that. So, I'm sorry, Krista.
Suppose that one could say, well, the governing body approves the DRO and adopts the DRO. So although it's not specific permission for the planning board to do that, since it's incorporated into the entire DRO, you could come to the conclusion that that is the permission granted by the governing body, but it still is a may and not a shall. And so maybe we need to change the word.
I guess that might make some sense, Tom, to consider slightly adjusting the language there. Is that something that we need to have the city attorney look at, Krista, perhaps?
I would defer to Amanda on that. I wouldn't think so. And
Yeah, I mean, if the board wants to get involved with that and the governing body wants to give us the authorization to do that, we can. Honestly, in the other 14 or 15 towns that we have, I have never participated in doing one of those. So it's not something that I've seen yet. So I'm just not sure how common it is for a planning board to get that involved.
I'm sorry.
Yes. I was gonna say, Tom, have you seen this in other municipalities with which you work?
We're involved with quite a few planning boards, and there's not one that I can think of or that I'm aware of that does this on an annual basis. I think they review capital projects as they come up, sort of as the courtesy or cursory review, but not, this is a pretty time intensive endeavor, I think, if you were to undertake it on an annual basis. We did discuss alternatives sort of at the subcommittee level, in that if there were interested members of the board to be involved in the capital planning of the city, that certain liaisons might be appointed to individual groups like the Board of Ed or, some entities that have decision-making over, the city's spending. I don't know if that makes sense in terms of having some sort of insight. So you have some input, coming from the planning board through the liaison that can sort of infiltrate those different groups.
It seems like it makes sense, but on the other hand, when we look back historically and you look at what's been going on in other planning boards in the state, it seems like it would be, out of the ordinary. And this board has an awful lot to do, on a monthly basis. I'm not sure have a lot of volunteers to step up to form a subcommittee to put together a 6-year capital plan and revisit it every year. If someone wants to do that, I wouldn't stand in their way. But I'm not sure we want to tackle that at this point unless people feel otherwise.
I have a related question.
Sure.
I hear you. That's a big undertaking to prepare a program of municipal capital improvements annually. But I did years ago talk with our previous attorney about the review of capital improvements. I know we often from the Board of Ed or from the city will get a discussion or a presentation about designs that are already completed and what they're planning to do. And it's a courtesy, and they share with us what they're planning to do, but it's not a review of any sort, really. It's just very, very nice of them to share it with us, so we're aware of what's going on. But in talking to our previous attorney, he said that there are, and I started looking them up, and I found about 14 or something randomly, cities that do more of a preliminary review and discussion about capital improvements before the plans are all said and done. And that is consistent with the MLUL and can be done by a municipality, and might be productive to actually give a little input or a little guidance early on at a schematic design level, as opposed to when it's all designed already. So that's just kind of in the same realm, but not certainly making the capital improvement project plans,
Right.
or program.
Yeah. That seems like it kind of falls a little bit along with items 2 and 3 in the sense for, more involvement either on the part of Environmental Commission or HPC or the planning board in things that come. So maybe that's something that I could visit with the mayor about and just see what her thoughts are on that, and get back to the board.
I think it's more like a presentation to the board, as sort of review, a little more than what we get now. I don't know if it's I don't recall what that other part is. I think that was with the review committee meetings, that 2 and 3. This was in front of the board to discuss what they're doing at a preliminary level.
We had a number of presentations over the years, on the community center for one, not too long ago. And then prior to that, from the school board on Franklin school additions. And frankly, Jennifer, if you recall, I think a number of the board members had some good suggestions actually for the Franklin school. But it was so far along, basically the bids have been taken, and the suggestions we had as a board, as brilliant as they were not acted on. So I think that's maybe something that I can do, is visit with the mayor and some other members of the team, and see what their thoughts are in terms of, getting us an earlier look at that, because I sense your frustration as well. I share your frustration with that.
I'm not that frustrated. I just think it seems like that, if we're here we're a resource, they could utilize us. And again, I don't think it would be like you must do this or that, but it might be helpful. And just to correct the record, the Franklin School, they did set back the addition a foot from the facade of this.
Oh, wow, victory. That was that, and the roof, matching the roof pitch was the other one that was a
Yeah,
problem.
they didn't do that.
They didn't do that. Okay.
That's okay.
All right, well, I'll look into that a little bit more.
So Bill, if I could
Yeah.
just mention that in terms of what the proposed DRO actually says, if we can either leave it the way it is, where it says shall, we can reword it where it would say may,
Mhm.
and then in the future, short-term, long-term, deal with the issue that Jennifer raised, which is maybe we want to have another whole section in the ordinance or a couple of paragraphs of provision about additional things that the planning board could. So that would maybe be for another day, but we have this paragraph now in the proposed DRO, and I think we need to either leave it the way it is or change it to may instead of shall.
I think may makes sense to me. Amanda, any thoughts on that?
I would concur with may, or just saying shall, comma, if authorized, have. Either one. I think.
Okay. Anybody have any opinions on one way or another, either by may or?
I think if we're gonna put shall, it should say what Amanda said, as authorized or instructed by the council.
Yeah.
Because isn't it the council that has the capital budget authority? If not, we should not leave the word shall alone.
Yeah, May seems to solve it, it seems to me.
Yeah.
But I could go either
But
way.
I think we should qualify it as instructed by council or whatever, because we don't want to leave it as if it's something we're supposed to do when we're really not to.
I agree.
And then
is it too silly to say, is it not, does it make any sense to say may or as authorized by council?
Yeah.
Yeah, either way, as long as it says we're authorized or instructed by.
So if that's okay with you, Amanda, will say may at comma as or as authorized.
That works.
All right. Okay, great.
Okay.
All right. We'll make that change. Tom, if you could make that change, that'd be great.
Will do.
Thanks, Krista, for making that, getting that done. Okay, so Tom, I'd like to see if you and Krista could pick up for item 6 and run us through the rest of the comments that you have on page 2, 3, and 4.
Okay. So number 6, we received a comment about possibly consolidating the various development application checklists that the city has, particularly in light of a recent board application where one of the checklists was not submitted and became a point of contention at the public hearing. In thinking about that issue, and Krista, feel free to jump in when I'm done. The thought was that in a way, it does make sense to consolidate it, but on the other hand, it might cause confusion in that when, you have a more lengthy checklist that applies to every single development scenario in the city, that people might be overwhelmed in terms of trying to complete that application and what might be applicable or might not. So it may make sense to leave them as specific checklists in terms of site plan checklist, subdivision checklist, et cetera.
Yeah, that pretty much was our conclusion. And coincidentally, Amanda might be well aware of this. Actually, Steve Warner did a seminar probably within the last year locally, and I don't know how many times he did the same seminar, inviting many members of the New Jersey Association of Planning and Zoning Administrators, which I'm a member of, and there were probably 50 planning and zoning officials of one kind or another in the room locally here, not right in Summit, but in the next town over. And the question and the subject was exactly whether the state should develop a uniform checklist to be used by every municipality. Not exactly the same question, but the same concept. And it was unanimously objected to by all of the zoning officials and planning and zoning board secretaries, just because as many things as you could think of to put on the list, something would be missing from some town, whether it's a dense municipality or a town at the shore or a town in, the Highlands. And it would just be so cumbersome. And what you would end up with would be waiver requested, waiver requested, waiver requested. We don't really think it's workable. We think it would be very frustrating and overwhelming for applicants, especially homeowners. So we're not in favor of that at all.
All right, so we'll basically leave it as is with the separate checklists.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, how about number 7?
Well,
Well,
by the-
anybody on the board, before I run to the next one, I'm sorry, I should ask if any of the board members have any objections or different opinions or would like to speak on it.
I was going to say, by the way, we're doing great. Just cheerleading here. Go on.
Okay, all right, on to item 7, the prod lighting question.
one sec. One thing I will say about the checklist is we, in the next go round, may well change the checklist for this number of plans or that number of plans or details, but those checklists are appendices, so they can really stand alone, and it's really not going to impact the meat of the ordinance if we put forth some further amendments, because we do have other things that are going into the future too.
Right.
So it could be that some of the checklists will be changed, but they'll be just purely standalone technicalities, if you will.
Okay, all right. All right, Tom, number 7.
Number 7 has to do with the proposed lighting in the prod zone proposed by BMS. They've been talking about raising the maximum light intensity to 4,000 K. And what that figure represents is the color temperature of the light. So on the higher end of the spectrum, which I think ends at about 10,000 K, it's more of a bright white or blue daylight, and on the lower end of the spectrum is more of a yellow, orange, or red. The 3500 standard is one that has been imposed, I believe, by the board engineer for the last couple of years. It's come to light that there may not be so many products out there that actually have 3500, and I think that's been the contention of BMS, that they don't want to go below 3500. So they're proposing the 4000 K fixtures on their site limited to a mounting height of 15 feet. And for reference, we found out recently that the Village Green actually has lighting that has 4000 K fixtures.
Yeah, the city actually did those lights in the green. So you want to go see them at night. One thing about the prod zone, and it would only apply to the prod zone, would be it's all of their lights and no perimeter lighting, no street lighting. You know, it'll be all basically interior and not very visible, and of course screened from the perimeter property lines. So the only reason it really wasn't put forth and supported by the director of the Department of Community Services when the issue came up separately from our review of the DRO was we didn't think, and Paul Cascais didn't think, that he had really some factual information to give people. He didn't want to just say, oh yeah, I support this because BMS wants it. Now we have some reference points, and so I think maybe the decision is going to be a little easier. Whether it goes to 4,000 or it doesn't, at least we'll have some informed decision making.
Well, I think if you look at a 3,500 and a 4,000, it's pretty hard to tell the difference. And the mounting height, it probably makes as much difference as the source itself. So I'm inclined to just say, let's move on and agree to the 4,000. It stays within the prod zone. It stays within their property lines, and move on from here. Everybody okay with that?
Yeah, all agree.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, all right.
The other issue initially was that they had tied it with the allowed uses, and we wanted to separate out the two issues. So that was the other issue with the lighting.
Okay.
Is
Hi, Beth. Thank you for joining us. And Beth is driving in her car, and hopefully she won't run over.
I am. So if I cut out, that's why. I apologize. We were supposed to be back at Summit by now, but we are not. So
Okay.
I'm in the car. So if I cut out, that's why. But
We won't take it personally.
yes, please don't.
Okay. Thanks for joining us. So
Yeah, no worries.
item 8, I guess we've already agreed to that one, Tom, and let's go on to item 9, I guess, unless anyone has any the definition that was offered last meeting, we all thought was good, and we said that was good. So I think we could move on to number 9.
I don't think the preservation easement was at the meeting. I think that was just in my notes. So I don't think the other board members know what we're talking about, probably.
Yeah, I believe this is a new item for the board.
Okay,
So,
sorry, Tom. Sorry.
yeah, the definition was proposed by Ms. Bolsonaro to include a definition of preservation easement, excuse me.
I
can explain it if you want.
Please do, yeah.
Take it
Well,
on.
I guess it was in a subcommittee that Krista and Tom and I had.
Correct, we spoke about it.
Got it.
That we thought we liked the definition, Jennifer. We thought it was good. So why don't you explain it?
Great. The only reason I thought we should have it is because we're actually getting a preservation easement for our old town hall, and this may happen again. So it's a thing that New Jersey does. And the definition that I gave is from the New Jersey Historic Trust, which provides preservation easement. So I thought their definition would probably be a good one. And I can either provide it to you guys or read it to you.
Well, why don't you read it?
Okay. A preservation easement is a legal instrument that provides enduring protection for a historic property. Residences, commercial structures, farmsteads, and formal gardens are a few examples of the types of historic properties protected by preservation easements. The historic property should be listed or be eligible for listing on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. A preservation easement is recorded in deed form in the county land records. The only edit I would make, because this is the New Jersey Trust, I just gave you theirs as they wrote it because I didn't want to change it or edit it. The only thing I would add is National Register, because we have a downtown National Register historic district. So that certainly would apply as well.
Okay, so Tom, you can make that adjustment.
Yep.
Anyone have any questions about it? It seems pretty complete.
Is the process for being registered laborious, or you have to be declared as potential for register? I'm sorry, you know what I mean?
Okay,
Like you,
so there's a National Register of Historic Places, and that is administered by the federal government. It's by the Department of Interior, and that National Register, anybody can do historic research and apply to get on the National Register, and our downtown is on the National Register.
but I mean, how do you be declared eligible? Is that a declaration, an official declaration of being quote unquote eligible?
Versus listing.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes.
Eligible is used. The reason that's mentioned is because a lot of properties in New Jersey and other states are deemed eligible by the State Historic Preservation Office, but nobody has had the time or money to make it official and do a National Register nomination or a New Jersey Register nomination. So the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, has determined it's eligible, but the paperwork hasn't been done. And that matters for certain legal things, like 106 review. If you need a permit, like to put a radio tower on top of your historic building, if you have an eligible building per the SHPO, then you have to go through 106 review, which is a federal process. Too much information, I'm sure.
Well,
I appreciate it.
this means that
Kristen knows about this.
this means that there's going to be a definition of what a preservation easement is.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have any regulation attached to it.
No, it's just saying this is what a preservation easement is. If you get one, or it's really an educational tool too, because we're getting one on one of our most historic buildings downtown. So that's good. And if somebody wants to know what it is, they could look it up in the DRO. So pretty simple.
All right, thanks, Jennifer. Anyone have any comments, questions? We want to move on to number 9, Tom?
Number 9, to address public art in public locations. So there was a comment about the planning board or common council should delineate public locations for public art, essentially. And the thought was that while the planning board is obviously the planning entity of the city, that they don't necessarily, the board doesn't necessarily have jurisdiction over public property within the city. And as far as I'm aware, there are certain entities that do the public art planning. I don't know, Christy, do you know a little bit more about how the city functions in that regard?
Well, what I know is that the suggestion that public art should be in a certain place sometimes comes actually from our engineering office, sometimes comes from SDI, sometimes comes from an artist. It could come from any source at all, and it would go through the common council, and there's a whole process, and there's a committee, the mayor has a committee. So exactly how they function, I don't know. And I did ask the city clerk and the deputy clerk to see what they have in their regulations as to the process, just so that they could be forwarded that information to Jennifer, because I really don't know. It's nothing that's ever come through this department unless it's just gone to a council subcommittee that Paul Cascais might have been on. And of course, Public Works usually gets involved in the actual installation or the removal or what have you. But I think Tom hit it on the head. Neither the planning board nor the zoning board has jurisdiction over public property.
We have Beth on the line here, so I know we have this art commission. Maybe Beth could just kind of fill us in a little bit.
There's a public arts subcommittee of the council that really deals with this, and they have a whole structure and fundraising arm, and then the approval goes through my committee, so it goes through community services. I think it's something that can exist outside of the planning board. I don't think there's already a very, intense review process that happens. It already goes through several layers of review whenever a project is proposed. So I don't think it's something that we need to restrict or put any kind of, parameters on that. I think that there's already a healthy review process that works very well.
Okay.
Beth,
I
Beth,
just wanted to make one comment since it was my question about how does it work? I didn't really know. The genesis of it was that at the State Historic Preservation Office, I was given an application for public art on one of the bridges in our town, and it's a New Jersey Transit bridge, and I just thought it made me think, we should probably give some guidance because it's a worthy endeavor. I love the public art. I think it's a great thing, but maybe some parameters would be helpful because New Jersey Transit didn't necessarily want art on their bridge. It's not our bridge to put art on. So, this poor artist, I imagine, was given this palette to work on, and then it ended up not happening because it really wasn't an appropriate place to put art. So that's where the nexus was.
I still don't know that we really need parameters because I think that process worked as well. I think they did at times the public art committee will look at different areas and see things that they think could be improved or the aesthetics of it could be improved and they explore it. But I don't think it had gotten down the road where there was a lot of time and effort put in before those approvals were sought, to be approved. And like I said,
Hey, Beth, you still there?
but I think there is a very, and I'd be imagine where potential valued. Yeah, can you now hear me?
Well,
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're fine. Maybe you can go back about 20 seconds and.
Yep. So I just think it's the kind of thing, sometimes art projects come to the council and I would have had I would not have imagined a piece of art there, like some of the murals or some of the pieces that have come to us. So I think I would rather leave it in the hands of the art committee to kind of look at the town and see where they think maybe an art project would be beneficial to town. And then we could look at getting the necessary approvals or whether that works logistically. I think there is a process. I think there is a whole healthy review. It goes through many layers. I think it probably works pretty well as it is.
Okay. Thanks, Beth.
Okay, thanks, Beth.
Yep.
Okay.
Sorry if it's cutting out.
No, you got it, Tom?
Okay, moving on to number 11, there was a language question.
Oh, yeah, overlay zones,
I'm sorry, we're on number 10, jumping ahead here. So the overlay zones, as I think the board is aware, are labeled OL1 through 7, OL1, OL2, et cetera. And there was a question about relabeling those zones to be more descriptive. So that's one alternative. On the other hand, each zone, I believe, does have somewhat of a description or of its intent and purpose within the narrative of the zone itself. So two different options for the board to deliberate.
I mean, I think if you open up each zone, there is as you say, there's a paragraph or a couple sentences right at the front of it. It tells you exactly what it is. And aren't all those overlay zones, or maybe one that's not, but aren't most of them as a result of the fair housing work that we've done, and aren't they all at least at present multifamily intended generally?
That's correct. I think they were generated from the affordable housing efforts for the most part.
So I understand what you're saying would be clear, but as soon as you open up and you read one, it's kind of right there.
I think also the challenge
it all comes out of the affordable housing work we did, a couple of years ago.
Right. So
I think also one of the challenges you may have in naming
housing overlay, because overlays are used for all sorts of different zoning. I mean, you should see New York City, it's got overlay over overlay, and they're all different overlays and they all have different names. I mean, right now we only have the housing overlay, but maybe someday we'll have a historic preservation overlay, or we might have a new markets, economic development zone overlay. I think that typically they're labeled in some way. It's just, it's not a big issue. I'm just thinking ahead.
Well, don't do that. No, I sort of feel like, at least at this point, it's pretty clear, and maybe when we do get to the point of having, a different overlay zone, maybe we label that. I don't know. It's up to the board. What
Doesn't
everyone
matter.
else.
I could drop it. You can move on. It's okay.
Let's move on.
All right. But, okay, so we hear the point. Okay, so back to 11 there.
Okay, number 11. So there was a language issue that was pointed out on page 147 of the text. Has to do with, sorry, I'm just trying to read it real quick. Where it talks about ground parking structures as may be permitted otherwise in this chapter. And I went through the ordinance and it doesn't appear that they necessarily are permitted elsewhere. And I think we chose this language in case one of the zones happened to be amended in the future, that it wouldn't preclude, this type of structure to be allowed in that zone. Sort of as I guess intended as a catch-all in case there was something that either we missed or again, a zone would be amended in the future that, otherwise this language would have to be changed, which isn't difficult, but again, just trying to have things not create any issues in the future, I guess is the way to sum it up.
So pull the zone name so as not to have to constantly re-edit.
To adjust the lists of zones. Yeah, I guess that's
Well, I
was the
think
intent.
the way we can't pull up the ordinance while we have Zoom because we get feedback in language, I think, if we did. So I'm reading off of Tom's response, and it should read, shall only be permitted in the LI, Prod 2, PI, which is professional institutional, the hospital, RO 60, that's okay. But we don't have a G1 zone. So I think the way we deal with gateway is GW-1 and GW- actually Roman numeral 2, Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2.
I don't understand this paragraph. The way it's written, above and below grade structure parkings are permitted, and then it says they're surface parking and below grade. What's the difference between above surface parking and then it says excluded in Broad Street West, where above ground and others? I don't understand how this is written at all. It seems as if all of them are allowed to do it, or it's weird the way it's written.
I agree the language should be improved. To answer your one question first, so below grade parking is obviously, anything below the surface of the ground, anything below grade. Surface parking is anything at grade, and any parking, essentially on the second level of a building or higher would be above grade parking. So it would seem, I guess the intent here is to at least allow, almost all types of structured parking in the listed zones, and everywhere else you'd be able to do parking on the ground or at least below grade parking, because it wouldn't have the same bulk impact that above grade parking might have, if that makes sense. So that's the intent, but it should be cleaned up.
Okay, so then, yeah, because when it says the Broad Street West and where above ground parking, so that's you've got above, below grade, surface, and then above ground parking.
Yeah,
does that mean two structures in the Broad Street West? Like, I just don't understand it. I'm not trying, I just don't, it's just weird, the language of it.
It is a little confusing.
I agree.
Maybe it needs to be separated into 3 sentences, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think it should be broken down by each of the zones exactly, not one long paragraph.
Agreed.
Okay.
So we'll come back with a red line version of that paragraph.
Breaking down by zones is a great idea, and maybe just taking out the catch-all.
And also though, is above ground parking structures different from above and below grade and surface? Is that another definition? Because I get what you're saying now. Above ground could be 2 levels, obviously below grade, and then surface is the street. But is above ground parking structures mean a deck?
I hear you. I think it was a poor word choice that we'll need to revise.
Okay.
When we redo the paragraph. But good input.
So,
Thank you.
Tom, right here, and I'm going to show my lack of understanding of this because I'm a bit confused too. But
okay.
does this give any leeway, which I don't think it should, but does it give any leeway for exceptions to go higher? Because it seems a little murky to me.
Well, I think the height is governed elsewhere in the ordinance. It's simply allowing or not allowing structured parking depending on this, whether it's listed or not. So to your point, I don't think it speaks specifically to height. That's a factor that's limited by zone. And I think that is covered elsewhere.
This is specifically.
Tom, would it help?
Number
Would it help if we
12
called
is
it-
height.
Yeah. Would it help if you called it above grade parking structures and surface parking lots? So that there's a clear distinction between the two?
I think that makes sense.
Okay. All right, so we'll clarify that. And you said red line, Tom, which is interesting. I guess the question is, as we go through this, how many more times we want to run this back through the committee members, the board members, excuse me, versus just trusting you to clean it up. So that's something we'll talk about at the end, but it's just an interesting point. I'm not sure how much more the board can take.
I hear you, and
Well, and
I think we're
also-
all interested in moving.
And from a timing perspective, the 24th is the last meeting before we would, as a group, be able to recommend changes to the council if they want to consider them in September.
Yeah.
So
I think, Matthew, I think we're having we may have a situation where we may have to punt one more month in order to get this, where it needs to.
right. Yeah. Okay.
Maybe the new language could be approved by email. Maybe it could be sent by email and not by a live meeting. Is that possible, or does it need to be done through a live meeting?
Live meeting would be preferable only because we can't have people responding to email chains like that. Form a forum, and then technically it's an open public meeting, which I know sounds ridiculous because it's an email, but we have to be careful with that.
We'll find a way to get the revised language to the board, and we'll figure out, I guess, what the best way to move forward.
With regard to ORC and with regard to the breweries, we may not be able to resolve those tonight. We may to resolve those tonight and get them in shape that we can, bottle this up, so to speak, for the 24th. But this, I think we should try. Okay, Tom. So we're on to number 12, height of parking structure.
Correct. So on the one hand, a language correction was proposed. I think we accept that language change. And then beyond that, there's a question that pertains to parking structure height. So I think at the moment, we're restricting parking structures in terms of feet. So essentially the top parking level would be the limit. So if the zone has a height limit of 55 feet, that would be measured from the uppermost parking surface. The alternative would be limiting it by the number of levels or stories and feet. I think you do it both ways. So it's a question of, I guess, what is the board's preference? I think.
Tom?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Wouldn't the parapet wall be the top point of measurement?
That's what I was going to ask.
If the surface, yeah.
The city and many other municipalities actually measure it from the top of roof and not often the parapet. And they usually give a little more leeway for the parapet, maybe an extra 4. I forget what it is in the city, but so that's the way the city commonly does it, let's say for a flat roof structure. And I think it's done it that way for parking structures too.
Is there a maximum height of a parapet wall?
I off the top of my head, I don't know what it is. I think there is. Krista, do you know if it's 4 feet or what the projection above the roof is? That's all.
I think it is 4 feet, and practically speaking, if you're spending the money to build a parking structure, you're not going to spend the money building a wall that's unnecessarily high.
Right.
Yeah.
And Tom, this pertains to what the code is for the zone. So say that a building downtown got a variance to go higher, it could not go that height. It could only go what it was zoned for on the books, correct?
Well, what it's zoned for, unless a variance is granted to allow it to go higher, but I suspect that would be a bigger undertaking.
In the case of the Broad Street West, for example, there is provision in that for a bonus. If there's certain things are done in order to improve the product, we can give them an additional level of the parking garage. So it can be an incentive or a bonus situation, Rick, to sort of answer your question in that particular case, without needing a variance, in other words.
So to be,
things in exchange for that.
so but to be specific here, though, if let's say the limit is 55 feet, the measurement is to the surface, which is, let's say that's 54 feet, but then you have a 4-foot parapet wall.
Yeah.
Doesn't that exceed then the height? You know what I mean?
The city and many other municipalities do allow for parapets and other, roof mounted structures to extend a certain amount. So to your point, yeah, if it's at 54, you'd have a parapet that extends to 58. I think that's a provision that's been typical in the city's ordinance. I mean, of course, anything can be changed. With respect to this one particular issue, I think the question is, let's say the height limit in the particulars, I'm just making this up, the height limit's 55 feet and you're allowed 4 stories. Can the parking garage accommodate 5 or 6 levels where only 4 stories are permitted? And is that something the city wants to discourage or not? Is that an issue? I think that's the question that's being framed.
I just opened the DRO as it was adopted in 2019 for the definition of height of building or structure is the vertical distance from the grade plane to the level of the highest point of the roof surface. But if you had a parking structure that didn't have a roof, then you would think, I think that's why this is worded the way it is as to the height of a parking structure, is it's pretty consistent with the definition of height of structure. And then, as Tom said, there are exceptions for roof appurtenances, and parapets are one of them.
And it says here, the unenclosed upper level of any above grade parking garage shall have a solid parapet of wall not less than 4 feet, or as otherwise may be required by building code, whichever is greater. So if we went, I don't know where the 55 feet comes from, Tom, maybe you can tell us about.
I just made up the 55 to give a hypothetical scenario.
Okay, so
it's probably less in most of the city zones, frankly.
Yeah.
But
So the parapet wall is an allowance, and with this definition remains that the parking level surface becomes the official distance.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, obviously we got to control the level of that floor or that roof or whatever you want to call it. That's where it needs to be controlled, because we all know there's going to be at least a 4-foot parapet. We really don't like cars falling off the top level of a parking garage.
Is there anything if somebody wants to put solar?
This, in the last ordinance version, we did allow for solar canopies over parking structures. So I think that was something the city wanted to encourage. So under certain parameters, they would be allowed to install solar canopies above a parking structure, limited to a certain height. It might be, I forget if it's 12 or 15 feet off the top of my head, but it's probably 15 feet. And with a setback from the building, I think was from the building wall.
So I think we're okay with it as written.
10 to 15 feet.
Excuse me?
Above parking structures, I don't remember.
I could look it up.
Ground mounted.
Let's see.
Remember I climbed up and measured?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was more like 18 or 20 feet.
Solar array canopy shall have a maximum height of 18 feet. That's ground mounted. Oh yeah, and then on a parking garage, solar array canopies may be attached to an undisclosed upper level of parking structure not to exceed 15 feet. So on the ground, you have 18 feet allowed for your solar panel. On a parking structure, it's 50 feet, and there's a required 50-foot setback from the lot line.
So that means that could be on top of the 55 allowed if we're doing our 55.
Yeah.
But you said a 15-foot setback. Is that what you said, though?
50 foot, it says here, solar array canopies adjacent to a residential use shall have a minimum setback requirement of 50 feet from the shared property line.
50.
50, yeah, 50.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Andy, 50, yeah.
That's it.
Okay. All right, everybody, okay?
Yep.
All right, ground mounted solar energy systems.
So there was a question that came up. I think we had initially approved a ground mounted solar panel height of 7 feet, reduced from 8 feet. And I think the thinking was that the city allows for a maximum fence height of 7 feet, which could provide screening for a 7-foot fixture. And the thought was, or the question is whether or not the 7-foot allowance for panels should be reduced further to perhaps say 5 feet or some other figure.
So that it's below the fence.
And it would be below the fence as opposed to level with it, potentially.
Initially, the way it was written and the way it is now in the ordinance is 8 feet. And so we suggested that it should go down to 7, but maybe it should go down more.
I think you still, if you're in the solar business, you still got to be able at some point, I guess, to get underneath and service this or do something. If it gets too low, you're going to have a hard time. I understand the point. You don't want it in somebody's backyard too high, but you know, you can't, I don't know that it go down 2 more feet. Maybe it goes down a foot, but at some point it becomes hard to service the thing. I would think. I'm not an expert on it.
I was the one that asked the question because I was picturing residential backyards, and most people's fences aren't 7 feet tall. They're usually shorter than that. But even if they are 7 feet tall, probably the solar panels, so that they're not visible, would have to be less than the maximum height allowed for the fence, I would think.
The ordinance
That's the
also restricts residential ground mounted solar to, I think, 10 square feet, Tom?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the screening of them, right, by the fence. So I just thought visually, I don't know if they can be the same height and be blocked visually. That was the genesis of the question.
Is there a
Well, at the moment, they're higher than what you can do. So certainly you couldn't, even if your neighbor put up a high one, do anything to hide it. So even at the 7, at least you could put a fence up that would at least be even with it. But at 8 foot as it stands, if somebody put one up and you don't have a fence.
So make it 6.
6 might be the reasonable middle ground, I guess.
Most people's fences are probably 4 or 6 feet, right? If you go to Home Depot and you buy a wood fence or whatever, they're 6 feet high. Most people in town have those, or a lot of people in town have those 4-foot metal fences. So at 7 or 8 feet, it's above anybody's fence. Very few people have 8-foot fences in our town.
Okay with
6 feet.
6 sounds like a reasonable compromise.
Okay. All right, great. 6 it is. All right, thanks. Item 14.
Item 14, so there was some language in the design requirements section of the ordinance, which I thought had been relocated. So the reason they were eliminated from the red line is because it was thought that they weren't descriptive enough to remain as sort of zoning provisions, but it may be appropriate to include them as instructive language in the beginning part of the design requirements section in terms of the intent and purpose of the requirements, and perhaps even expand that language beyond building additions and buildings as the language currently.
I think that generally makes sense, but Krista was pointing out to us that this language was somewhat difficult to enforce from a zoning perspective. Maybe Krista, you could give us a little more background on your thoughts on this. I remember you telling us about it.
Well, I do feel that way because what the planning and zoning board members know is what comes to them. What they don't know is 5 times more that comes in as a permit application from you or your neighbor or somebody down the street. So it's very difficult to read this and say to someone who wants to do an addition on their house that they don't need any variances for. Well, you can't do that because it doesn't meet this language. So I'm totally understanding of the goal. I would put it into the design standards, and it's just not quantifiable, measurable, black and white, and it would be very difficult. And people, I think, some people will be happy about it and some people will be very like, well, who are you to say that you don't think this is in harmony with the architecture of the neighbor? So difficult.
Well, this came up because it was the same language that we used for that had been in our ordinance from the signage. So in our November meeting, we all agreed that it made sense for additions and buildings, but if you think it belongs somewhere else, that's fine. I don't think it's a huge stretch, of course, because you're already using the same exact language for signage in Summit and have been for many years. But I'll leave it to the board.
As I mentioned, I think an appropriate location might be the intent and purpose of the design requirements to begin with. I think in that section of an ordinance, you are allowed to have, sort of aspirational, descriptive language versus a more concrete zoning standard. That might be one alternative. Or if anyone has any other ideas, we could throw them around too.
I mean, that seems to make sense to me. It seems appropriate. It seems like a good fit for that area because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give people guidance as to what, from a qualitative point of view, they should be considering and they should be doing, perhaps not necessarily quantitative completely.
Agree. I agree with that. For sure.
That means it goes in the appendix or in the other part that's about general design.
Well, if we did what I just mentioned, it would remain in that same article. It would just be relocated as, sort of, they exist as their own separate sections within a section, and they'd be captured in the beginning of that article under the intent and purpose of why there are design requirements in the first place. And these are some of the qualitative goals of the city.
Okay, thank you.
So section 14 is within the body of the DRO. It's not the guidelines that are in the appendix.
Right.
Okay, all right. Just want to be sure everybody understands. All right, good. Thanks, Tom. Item 15, dormers.
15 dormers. So the question was whether or not, I guess this language should remain or not. And if the board recalls, the issue that came up was there was a house, I forget which street it was on, but basically had an attic dormer that gave the appearance from the street that it was a third story of the house. And we were trying to prevent that sort of thing. And there were some examples shown as to why this may or may not work. I think the distinction was in the examples is that, let's call it like a craftsman home that was 2 stories, but the dormers were on the 2nd floor as opposed to a 3rd level attic. That if it's on the 2nd floor, it could essentially be as big or as wide as an applicant wanted to. It's when it's above the 2nd floor or the 3rd level of the house that it's restricted to 50%. I mean, it's a figure that could be adjusted any which way or eliminated altogether, but that was the thought process.
So one question I had is we're not encouraging 3-level homes as we speak, right? Is that we're trying to keep?
This tries to discourage the appearance of a 3-level single family home.
So we're not encouraging a 3rd level as an occupiable level, but it would appear from the street that it was a 3rd level. Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct. There was one house in particular that had been developed that way, and we were trying to prevent more from being developed that way. And attics in general are also governed by FAR in the city. So there's a floor area limitation, and this would also seek to limit the physical appearance from the outside. But again, it's a standard that could be modified.
Krista, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my thought is that when this talks about limited to a maximum of 50% of the width of the floor below, the way that's going to be applied is the cumulative width of, let's say you had one big dormer in the middle and one on either side, that's 3 dormers. The cumulative width of those 3 dormers would not be permitted to be more than 50% of the width of the floor that's directly below. It's not each one can't be more than 50. If you only have one, it can't be more than 50. But if you have 3, then all 3 added together can't be more than 50%.
Well, just to clarify, the language as it states actually does say any individual dormer. So if the intent is to be cumulative, then we would have to change
I
it.
think we
The
need
intent is to be cumulative.
that.
Okay, then we change that.
I mean, I think that's what the intent was, and I really just recently realized it doesn't say exactly.
No. Okay.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure,
Can you
Beth,
guys,
go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. So I have a personal vested interest in this because usually the illustration of double dormers gone wrong is the house immediately across the street from me that I look at every single day when I leave my house. But I think that, and I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but I thought that Jennifer's proposed language was good on this. And I think there is a difference between dormers on the front of the house and the back of the house. And I don't know if the DRO specifies that, because in some of the capes that have been expanded, I could see them dormering out the whole second floor, and that would be fine, and wouldn't necessarily be a design distraction. But the problem is on the front of the house when the dormers are on top of each other, taking up too much space, where it really looks odd and inappropriate. So I do think there's some attention that needs to this. I mean, there are dormers that go more than 50% that look completely appropriate given the style of the house, but it's kind of that dormer on top of a dormer that really is the problem.
Well, we permit 2-story houses and we don't permit 3-story houses. So
Right.
a total second floor is a total second floor. And even if it was, as you say, a small cape that had all of a sudden a wider dormer on the second floor, this regulation wouldn't pertain to that at all.
So it would allow that. Okay.
Yes.
I don't have it in front of me, so I'm not looking at it, but I do know it would, because I'm driving, but I do know that was an issue. And we wanted to make sure we kind of stop the problem that I see every day from happening in the future if possible.
Yeah, the operative word here is the width of any individual attic dormer.
Okay, the attic dormer, so that pertains only to the third floor. Okay.
Well, it does say attic dormer above the second floor. So even if it's an attic, I mean, an attic could be technically above the first floor, but in this case, it's
Right.
attics above the second floor.
Okay.
That'll work for you,
Jennifer,
Beth?
do you have any comments on this? Because you have it in front of you, and I know you and I have discussed it, but
Right.
do you have anything to add?
I think that I understand where everyone's coming from, Krista and Tom. I think that the initial concern might have gotten lost a little bit, because even if you do a 50% dormer on top of an existing dormer, it's still going to not look great. So I feel like, I understand in most instances, the 50%, if it's divided up or not, helps on a dormer above a second floor. However, that wouldn't have changed Beth's view. It would only have changed it so that the dormer on top of the dormer would be 50% of the size, which still would not have looked right. So it's helping, but it's not solving for that particular issue that we were trying to solve for, unfortunately. Would you agree, Beth?
I think so, but I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have the wording of the ordinance right in front of me.
Right, right.
And I do think it's a problem when there's an existing dormer and then it's dormered on top. It can be a problem, but
right. I think that's part of in the language, if possible, to somehow say that if the second floor is already a dormer, no dormer should be put on top of an existing dormer. It just doesn't work. But I'd like to hear from the other board members what they think.
If I could just jump in, I think the way you just put it helped me to understand it a little better by prohibiting dormers above a dormer.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the way to phrase it, if that's what we're talking about.
That's how it all started.
Okay.
I think this is now turned into something also helpful, I guess, but that wasn't the concern, the percentage of dormers. It was really that we just had this example of a dormer that was built on top of another dormer, and it doesn't work for the neighborhood.
That makes sense if you can draft that in such a way that it's clear. That might be a little bit of a challenge, but take a shot at that if you will. That's my perspective. I think that's a good idea.
Thank you, and I apologize that I wasn't expressing myself very well, not having it in front of me, but I appreciate it.
No, but we got the issue cleared up. Thanks, Beth.
Thanks, Beth.
But also this one is also good because if you had a third floor and you put a giant dormer on it, you'd still have the appearance of a third floor. So I think born
I
out of that
agree.
is this one, which is also still should be included.
I agree with Matt.
Well, thanks, everybody. Good job.
Thank you.
Historic district map, Tom.
Well, I think we, as you mentioned earlier, Bill, we are going to try to tackle the historic preservation part of the ordinance in a comprehensive way, hopefully sooner than later. The map would seem to be part of that. I think the thought is that if we include it in the DRO now, one, there are no regulations in the DRO that specifically speak to it, and I don't know the history in terms of its implementation, whether or not it's gone through the necessary channels to become let's say, an official map of the city.
Krista, do you have a sense of that?
I do. Tom and I have discussed it. I think he put it very succinctly that at the time when the HPC regulations are adopted, I think that's the time to provide a map, whether it's the one that everybody looks at now or something, a different version of that, or whether it's just a list of historic places and not a map. So I think that's for future discussion.
Okay. Any other comments from the board on that? So item 17, Tom.
There was another comment, I guess also pertaining to historic preservation, primarily about whether a structural engineer report should be required for a proposed demolition. It may be worth, I mean, we could certainly discuss it now, but it may be worth not to punt, but to put it with the historic preservation conversation.
Well, I think that's a good point because, you know, Jay, you asked for that in the 85 Maple Street, whether or not that building, you know, the contractor kept saying it's structurally unsound. And Jay, you asked him, well, where's the proof of that? And I mean, anybody can say that. I'm not saying that he's lying. I'm just saying, I don't think it necessarily just applies to an historic preservation property. I think it applies to that property in particular, and we should probably have something that they're separated.
I think that goes to the issue of demolitions, you know, wholesale demolitions in general, which we haven't quite tackled, whether they're historically significant or not. That's something we can try to deal with now or later. And whether or not this becomes part of that, you know, that's.
And Tom, is an engineering report about the stability of evidence that a planning board can use to make a decision?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It can be. The question is whether or not it should be required. That's the question. So an applicant.
Can it be?
Well,
can we require that?
That's sort of the point I'm getting at. Without any other type of demolition prohibition to tie it to, I don't know how you could begin to require it. And again, then you have the. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Tom. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say then there's the distinction between something that's historically significant or not.
And then, you know, maybe Amanda, have you seen in any of your work, the firm's work, where if there's either a not historic building or an historic building and someone comes in for a demolition permit?
We've actually had that issue come up in a few towns only because the Historic Preservation Committee would find out after the building was destroyed. And then they'd be like, hey, nobody told us this was even coming before anybody or even just a permit. So in one of the towns, I think we tried to make it part of the permitting process, but I'm not even sure if that ordinance got adopted yet, just because there were so many difficulties with that as far as notice and who's going to have so much time to comment. So it really depends how we could do it.
Krista, anything that you could tell us about what happens in Summit for a demolition permit?
It's just a construction permit and it's routinely granted and they're really not ever not granted. There's not.
What we're concerned with mostly is historic buildings, right? I think, you know, if I want to tear down my 1951 home, which I can tell you is not historic, you know, I don't see why I'd have to do anything for that, but you know, if we had the Bank of America building in downtown Summit, we might want to at least know about it, you know, or have some inclination.
Sort of the issue, just because how do you quantify what's historic? Then do we just say anything over 1950 and then everybody who has an older house has to come and deal with
Well, we
that?
have a map, but we're not allowed to use
Yeah.
it.
Right.
Well, I
let's
think we're
have
going
a
to
map.
address it in our discussions about historic preservation. That one of the, that certainly that whole topic should pick up this, I think.
It seems to me we're focusing mostly on historic significant buildings, and that that should be a part of the process unless other people feel differently. Okay, all right, so let's put that on Tom for our next thought process with regard to historic preservation, whether, as your point, Matthew, is a good one, whether we could even require such a thing. We don't even know if that's something we can do even as a part of the historic preservation ordinance. So we just have to work on this a little bit more. But certainly, as Jay pointed out, in the 83 Maple, they said that, and also they're going back a few years, homes that were torn down, or one big home rather, two homes built in its place at the intersection of Morris Avenue and Kent Place Boulevard, right as you go over the bridge towards Chatham, immediately to the left, there was a big home, and one of the important points being made by the applicant was that the structural, and they brought a structural engineer in, and he testified that, you know, the cost of repairing the structure was, you know, was significant. So those are the two cases that I was aware of in the past that applicants have brought up the aspect of structural compromises in the buildings as a reason to tear them down. Okay. All right. So we've done that. All right. So back to the top of the list, we have the two issues that I think we have to deal with right now are going back to the ORC1, and then we'll follow that up with the breweries. And then I want to, at the very end, and I think if it's okay, Amanda, I'll hold off on your spreadsheet because one of the things on your spreadsheet is breweries. And so we can talk about that. And then maybe with regard to the ORC1, you know, we've been kicking this thing around quite a bit, and it's something that's kind of important. And we had, I guess it's 603 Springfield Avenue, there's a construction fence around it now. It looks like something's going to happen there. But because of the size of the lot, the 25% floor area ratio and or the 7,500 square foot limit, you could create some pretty large structures there, which the neighbors across the street were, you know, I think that's R10 zone, I think maybe
Yeah, it's R10.
R10 zone across the street were really upset. So we had, you know, a lot of controversy. It's been to the zoning board, and it's been determined now that I guess that they're going to tear the structure down and rebuild from the foundation up. I think that's the last I heard. But anyway, so it's been kind of an issue. So we have two alternatives. One, which is a simple alternative, which is simply to say, we'd like to change it from 7,500 square feet to 4,000, 3,500, 4,500, but something small. In the email that Tom sent out to all of us on August 11th at 12:46 p.m., there is a map and a couple of photographs of homes in that area. And in the map shows the current ORC, the current R10, and the current multifamily. I don't know if you all can pull it up, but it'd be very helpful if you could. It's a good exhibit. As the subcommittee began to talk about this a little bit more, I think it was Krista who came up with alternative two as one idea of perhaps dealing with it. And maybe Krista or Tom, or maybe one or both of you can explain sort of what your thinking is with this other alternative. It's not shown in the diagram, but if you pull the diagram up, you can see which lots that Krista is referring to and Tom are referring to.
So maybe would it be instructive if I pull that map up? Would that help?
Yeah.
Or does everyone have it?
That would be awesome.
All right, let's see if I can do that.
Yeah.
All right.
So I'll keep, while he's doing that, I'll keep going just for a minute. We spent some time with Steve Warner. Oh, he did that fast. Anyway, he spent some time with Steve Warner and talking about this alternative one, alternative two, and what the differences were as it relates to the processing, so to speak, of this as it relates to public, input. And so the alternative one is fairly straightforward. We would make the change, so it's lower square footage, perhaps. And then it would go off to council, would be introduced, and it would come back to the planning board, as for master plan consistency. Then there's a public hearing. With regard to alternative one, we believe at this point, Steve Warner thinks this is correct, that we'd only have to notice the property owners within the ORC zone that we're making this change of adjusting the square footage. If we went to alternative two, because we are changing the zone, in essence, removing the ORC and expanding R10 and multifamily a little bit, then we would have a much broader notice requirement in that case to everybody within 200 feet of the ORC zone and the MF zone, which is not the worst thing in the world, it's just a different notice procedure. Either way, it would has to go to council for review, and we would certainly provide some kind of memorandum to council with an explanation of the changes we made between the current DRO and the proposed DRO. We would explain our thinking on this. But so that's just in general, the two alternatives. And so I'll be quiet here, maybe let Krista or Tom kind of discuss their thoughts on this idea they have for going to perhaps an R10 approach.
I'll take a stab at it. So I haven't been around long enough, but my understanding is that the intent of the ORC's one zone when it was created was to primarily preserve the existing home at the time on lot 8. So all the way on essentially on the left of that yellow highlighted area. It turned out that after that zoning was in place, the house was demolished anyway, and a new single family dwelling was constructed within the last, let's say, 15 years or so ago. If you look at the other development that's existing there today, you obviously have the church that's existing on lot 4. To the right on lots 2 and 3, you have the what were existing dwellings converted to office uses. Moving back to the left side, sorry to keep going back and forth. Lot 7 was the development we were just talking about that had the structural issues and received board approval for an approximately 7,500 square foot building. And it's come to light that perhaps 7,500 is, maybe too big for this zone in relation to surrounding development. And then you have existing single family homes on lots 5 and 6. So with regard to alternative 2, some part of the thought process is that you already have sort of lots 4, 7, and 8 kind of taken out of the equation. So that leaves lots 2, 3, 5, and 6. And the exhibit that was submitted showing the street view of those dwellings is whether or not those exhibit features warranting some level of preservation effort. And so I guess that seems to be the crux of it. And then the alternatives that were posed, instead of recreating a new zone or tweaking the ORC1 zone, would be that lots 2 and 3 would be merged into the MF zone, which is sort of naturally surrounding it and across the street. And they're also kind of separated from any other single family homes in the vicinity, particularly by the church to, I'll call it the left, I guess it is also the west. And then the other lots 4 through 8 could also naturally fit in the surrounding R10 zone. And also by doing that, the ORC1 allows for an FAR of 40%. The R10 zone allows for an FAR of 25%, excuse me. So you would effectively reduce the building size on most lots that could be developed. However, on lot 7, given the size of that lot, you'd still, an FAR of 25% would still allow for an approximately 7,500 square foot dwelling.
Yeah.
So if you took the thought of perhaps limiting that area to 4,000 square foot, these particular lots would be reduced to an FAR of approximately, depending on the lot, could be as low as 10 or 12%.
So you had a couple of photographs and in handwriting, you showed lot 5 and 6 projected at 25% FAR.
Mhm.
And, comparing that to the proposed, let's say 4,000, some were a little bit lower and some were a little bit higher.
Correct.
So to me, if you're an owner of those lots, perhaps today, if you're living in at a single family home, and I believe both of them are owner occupant buildings, 5 and 6, they may not care. It may make a difference to them when they go to sell it, because might, more square footage might be worth something to somebody, perhaps, or an addition could be added. And then you go to lots 2 and 3 where the law firm is in 2, and I'm not sure what building, what use occupies building 3. It looks almost like an old historic building. How do those people feel about being converted from ORC to multifamily? How does that affect them in terms of their economics or their view of the world? So when we think about this collectively, alternative 2 cleans this up in a very neat and tidy way, I think, and there's some consistencies between the south side of the street and the north side of the street. On the other hand, it's going to be more public approval intensive, and I think there's a good chance you may have 1 or 2 of these people pop up and say, no, I don't want you to do that. But I don't know. So that's why we wanted to present this to the board, just to get everybody's reaction. The simplest thing to do is just change the FAR to 4,000 or 4,500 or 3,500 and go on down the road. But that's still, you still have to notice the people in the ORC zone as well for that. So I guess, I'd like to hear what other board members have their reactions to the alternative 2.
Can I just ask one question before we do that? Is the planning board's desire also to, I know a lot of times when commercial and residential kind of cohabitate, the spirit is, I would really like to see it become a little bit more residential, or no, we're okay with it becoming more commercial. Is there an interest in this larger area shifting more residential, or, you know what I mean? Not even just the buildings themselves, but is this whole area?
Well, it's a great question, Matthew, because I think people in general were thinking that this was going to be older historic homes that were going to be converted to office use, and to a certain extent remain like the ORC district in downtown Summit. These lovely old buildings that have architects' offices or whoever, dentists, etc., occupying these nice buildings, and it would
That feel residential, but are
we can maintain that residential feel, but would have commercial uses and mixed uses in some cases in them.
Because what you zone it will eventually start to tip the scale in one direction or another.
Sure.
And that may be worth considering on the zone changer.
So when you think about it, though, if you look at home number 8, it's quite a nice home, big but very nice. 7 will be multifamily, I guess, with maybe a little bit of commercial mixed in. You have 2 homes at 6 and 5, homes across the street. And, so in other words, assuming there's no changes in 5 and 6, it's going to remain residential, effectively residential for quite some period of time. So the ORC zone, I'm mumbling on here, but the ORC zone intentionally was to have the same effect that it was in downtown, which is older historic buildings, maintaining the residential feel, but allowing them to convert to commercial or mixed uses. That was the intent.
Tom, that's right. Bill, sorry. It was a knee-jerk reaction to create the ORC1 zone, and it became -1 because we had the ORC zone on DeForest. It works on DeForest for a few reasons. The lot sizes are pretty consistent. Some of the properties already were mixed with commercial and residential, and they're close to the downtown. So the desire was there to utilize those pieces of property in an ORC manner. Here, there was, Tom was exactly right. The house where the yellow house is now is the one that was felt, oh, if we make this ORC1, the same thing will happen. Well, it didn't happen. And it's been many, many years, and it's not happening. It's not going to happen. But for many years also, neighbors have voiced a preference for the houses to the left of the church to go into a single family zone, because there's the comfort is, okay, I know what it's going to be. It might be bigger than my house across the street, but I know what it's gonna be. It's gonna be a single family house. It's not gonna be a business. It's not gonna be more traffic. It's gonna be what it is. And so that was when I did this map and I looked at the sizes of the lots and figured on the 25% FAR, that's roughly what the sizes of the lots are according to the tax records. And based on 25% FAR, those are the floor areas that you could get. I think if you want to maximize it at 4,000 square feet FAR, you don't change the zone and you don't make it an R10 zone, because you can't have R10 zones all over town with 25% FAR, except for U4, you're maxed out at 4 in that same zone. I don't think that would be legal.
Right, I get you. Yeah, that makes sense.
It seems to me, Bill, that oh, sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just gonna say, I think that was just if we left an ORC zone, after talking to those who were involved with making the original ORC one here, they just didn't envision the buildings being that big. And so that was just a quick way to try and keep it residential character. That's what it is, office residential character. And I think that the houses that are there are probably smaller because of the topography. The back of those giant lots were a big hill, and they just built, relatively normal size 3,000 and 4,000 square feet or less sized homes. But it's an interesting problem. And the feedback, to answer Matthew, a lot of the feedback we got when we reviewed the multifamily property that we did approve was that all the neighbors came out and they just said this ORC zone was a big mistake. This is a residential zone. We don't understand why it's zoned this way.
That's what I remember too, Jennifer, is the neighborhood saying, we would much rather have it be single family.
Right.
Is there a reason we can't make those 4 lots, that is number 5 through 8, residential? I think I certainly agree with everything that has been said, Jennifer in particular, that is a residential area. It feels residential, and the church is big enough that it provides a break from clearly an office, hotel, commercial area to the east. It seems to me that those lots logically should be single family, but the 2 lots to the east of the church, that is number 2 and 3, they are office. They are exactly what was intended. Can they not be left, or can they be converted to an office zone and 5, 6, 7, and 8 single family?
Or Jay, I like the way you're going with this, Jay, because it feels that way, So
that's what the market, that's what people have done.
Small. Can you have a zone, let's say ORC, if you kept ORC on lots 2, 3, 4, and then went to R10 for 5, 6, 7, 8, those are pretty small. And I know there's issues, Tom or Amanda or somebody can tell me with the size of zones and whether you're getting closer to spot zoning or whatever. But Jay, I think I like where you're headed with that.
Can you have that multifamily in R10? Lot 7?
You can, it becomes an existing non-conforming use.
It becomes an existing non-conforming. Okay.
Right.
Yes.
I like that idea too, because Jay is exactly right. This is a residential neighborhood, and it feels like a residential neighborhood, and it all of the kids and everybody cuts up High Street to go to the high school, and that's all residential. It's 25-mile-an-hour speed zone over there, and the other 3 lots are totally different.
What happens to lot 4?
Well, I could stay ORC if you kept 2, 3, and 4 ORC. It could stay that way. I don't know exactly. Maybe Amanda.
We have to think about what happens if the church goes away. Do we want it to be residential or do we want it to be ORC? Because there's no residential building there on that property. I just don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. It can't be its own zone. It has to be something.
Right. It has to either go to the residential or go to the ORC with the other 2, if that's where we're going. But I don't know which is better. Tom, what do you think?
I think originally we were inclined to include it in the R10 for the reason that one, houses of worship, I think, are permitted there. They may also be permitted in the ROC1 zone. I can't recall off the top of my head.
I'm leaning
But-
towards the residential also.
Well, then you end up with lots 2 and 3 and some kind of different. If I own
Well, then
lot-
the problem with that too, then Bill, is if those people do decide that they don't want to have their office there anymore, and somebody wants to go back, and they are residential buildings. One's a real estate, one's a lawyer.
Mhm.
So if somebody wants to move back into it as a residential house, does that mean they're not permitted?
Right.
That's a good question. I mean, in other words, Andy, to be sure I understand your question, if it stayed ORC,
Yeah.
could you move back into it as a single family home? I don't know. Krista, did you know?
I'd have to look at the ORC regulations.
Well, single-family dwellings are permitted uses, I thought.
I think a single family is permitted
Yeah.
per R10, I believe is what it
No,
says.
I thought ORC1 though, it is also.
That's what I mean.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I,
it creates
I
an
think,
issue.
I think residential would be permitted.
It would
Okay,
be,
so
They're
then,
currently office, but they could remain office or they could be residential.
yes.
so then,
the
so
suggestion is-
Jennifer's question was important, because if the church ever left, you could put a massive project on that thing there.
So we need to control for that.
So if it was R10, then you'd have to come back to the board for subdivision if you, let's say, wanted to make 4 homes in there, or 3 homes or whatever.
Right. Which would be fine.
Yeah, so, but if it was ORC, you could end up with something that's
We don't know because it was written not so great.
out of character. So if you make a lot 4 R10, can lots 2 and 3 be R10, but with some kind of non-conforming?
I mean, that was my question, is if they're non-conforming, while anything they wanted to do would have to come before the board, right? It still would make it, it sounds like everyone wants this to lean residential.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So even if they're 2 and 3 are non-conforming, it probably wouldn't be pleasant. They want to go put something, make a change to it, but
We can grandfather in, or their existing use would be grandfathered in. And then, you know, when they, I don't know when that ends, I guess when ownership changes, then it goes back to residential. How does that work?
Well, what's it?
It only goes back to when a non-conforming use can continue indefinitely, cannot be expanded or intensified.
And if it burns to the ground in a fire, it can't be replaced, right?
Or a stiff wind, yeah.
Yeah.
Or stiff wind, yeah, all right, if it blows down. Uh,
When it's sold, it can, right?
No,
Yeah, it can go from a lawyer's office to a dental office. It's when it's at the point of, let's say, building expansion or site improvement, then it becomes expansion of a non-conforming use, a D2 variance before the zoning board, as opposed to a permitted use by the planning board.
which by, if the board's pleasure is that this to become residential, that isn't a terrible thing either, is it?
No, that sounds.
No, that's
I
fine.
want to be sensitive to the economic value that lot 2 and 3 have in their ORC zone, though, right?
so think of it a little bit of another way. If you put lots 2 and 3 in the R10 zone, those 2 uses are non-conforming. We don't know what the reaction on the part of those 2 owners would be. If you put those 2 lots in the MF zone, the existing uses are non-conforming in the same way that they would be non-conforming if they were in the R10 zone. And we still don't know what the owners might have as a reaction to that. So we can talk to them, or we can just say, you know what, we think it's appropriate for it to be in the R10, or we think it's appropriate to be in the MF. Either way, they're going to be non-conforming.
Can I just ask, and you know, I'm fairly new, so I don't know all the regulations, but can the owners object to us changing the zoning?
Yeah,
I honestly don't know, so.
So
that
yeah,
might-
we can.
conversation too has to do with, you can rezone things without, as they say, super notice.
Okay,
If it is something that is in reaction to the master plan, such as what we're doing in all the other areas. So if the master plan and and the subsequent reexamination reports address this beyond just passing, then I think Steve thinks, okay, you can do zone changes. You could change the zone. You can say, we're doing this based on master plan recommendations.
Okay.
If
The master plan refers to
applies
this.
to that-
Sorry, Chris, I apologize. Go ahead.
If the master plans don't rise to the level of allowing for rezoning of these lots, you can propose an ordinance change and do the super notice that you're required to by the MLUL. You can also do a master plan reexamination, study and report just for these lots. And then those are advertised and there's a public hearing, just as there was for the rest of the master plan. But this is a reexamination report with a narrow focus, and everybody is noticed. But then when you actually go to take the steps of creating the change that you determine in the master plan reexamination report, then you don't have to do the super notice.
Okay.
I think that Steve feels, and I had a discussion with him, and maybe Amanda has some input too. I think he is tending to say, it's so serious a change that it would probably be best to either do a reexamination report or do the super notice. Once you decide which lots you want to put in what zone, what do you want to call them?
Chris, I know we, in the master plan re-exam we finished, 3 years ago, we refer to or say something about the fact that we need to study the ORC1 zone, some reference to that if I recall. But I don't know if it's specific enough, as you say, that you could get away with simply doing a lesser notice provision and make that change.
If that was 3 years ago, that makes it a little bit harder.
Okay, Amanda, thanks. Okay, so it ends up being a pretty big deal if we decide to go the R10 route in terms of that. But in a lot of ways, it works really well. On the other hand, if we could subdivide and keep ORC, perhaps, I can't imagine you can do ORC in buildings 2 and 3 alone because it's so small. Can you do a zone that's only 2 lots and not call it spot zoning? And then you would have R10 include the church all the way to the west from lots 4 through 8 in R10?
I can look into that. The only thing I'll say that since it's an existing zone, it might be a little bit different, only something that's already existing. We're not creating it just for those 2 lots.
Yeah.
I could look into that.
So there would be no change to those 2 lots.
Right.
Then obviously the change would be 4 through 8. I think the comment that Jay made was really putting us on the right track. And then the idea, I think Jennifer said, of putting the church in the R10 sort of solves that problem. I like that a little better than going multifamily because it continues to keep a single family feel along the street, but multifamily could work too, I think, obviously with the hotel across the street.
And then what happens with 2 and 3?
Yeah, I don't know. Amanda's going to have to check and see if 2 and 3 stays ORC. And if your question, Matthew, is what happens if it goes, if you rezone it multifamily, what happens to 2 and 3?
I think
Or
we should do
R10.
it all R10.
R10.
Yeah.
I think we should do it all R10 and see what happens. I don't think you want 2 and 3 being multifamily because that gives them the opportunity to put apartments there, and that changes the feel of the block.
I
think
don't
you
live
want
in-
if they.
I agree with you, Andy.
Also, you could, I would imagine the long plays.
Hey, Paul, speak up. I can't hear you.
Couldn't
I
hear
would
you,
say,
Paul.
I imagine that the long play is for someone to aggregate the lots 2 and 3 together
Yeah.
and create a larger development site at some point if it stays under the current zoning.
Yeah.
Or that they remain, that's R10 and they become single family homes, each in their own right. And in a sense, the spirit of fighting for an R10 is a noble one in that you want to restore the wholeness of the neighborhood to become residential and peel away the different layers and make it very clean and take away the uncertainty of, oh my God, what could be put there one day? Basically saying there's no uncertainty. We want them to be single
Right.
family.
And they are single-family homes now. They're used as offices.
Right, and you're
They're not
maintaining
a-
the
that-
existing,
Yeah,
and you're maintaining the existing uses at the same time.
yes.
So if I hear what the board, we're saying the whole zone ORC1, let's take it to R10 and not change the lot 2 and 3 to multifamily. And so I guess the question would be, how does that, if I'm stating, if everybody's in agreement with that, the question, what's the impact on the DRO schedule on the 24th of August? My sense is that we're going to have to drop back for maybe a month and study this thing and figure out how we do it and what our process and proceeds are, how we proceed rather. So not that I want to push this back, I'm not advocating that necessarily, but this thing is maybe a little more complicated than just a write-up and sending it off to council.
Well, and based on what Steve Warner said, it could be even longer. So the kind of beauty of putting all of the lots in the R10 zone is just simply changing a zoning map and getting rid of dropping ORC1. It could be done very simply as a change even after, in 2 months' time, or if we need to do a reexamination report or do something more sophisticated than just amend the ordinance. It could really, again, be kind of a standalone thing. It's not like you're creating a new zone. It's R10. We already have that zone.
So I guess you could push ahead. I'm sorry?
It's probably what preceded the ORC anyway.
That's probably right. So if we like this approach, I think what we need to do is tomorrow get on the phone with Amanda and Steve perhaps and figure out what the process is, see what kind of impact it has on the DRO. Maybe, I don't know that we want to go ahead and send the DRO out the door on the 24th, so to speak, and then have to come back and do a whole new zone, or maybe we do. Maybe that's okay to do that.
Well, Councilwoman Little did mention, I don't know if she's still on the phone, but that she and the council were okay with doing 2 layers, that there was sort of an immediate first round and then a second round that contains some of these larger issues.
Well, let us work on that and we can talk about that on the 24th. So the objective would be go R10 and see if we can get this thing off to council on the 24th. Let's see if we can do that in the next day or two, and we'll report back to the council on the 24th on that. So I think that's clear. All right, so now we'll go to the fun stuff, breweries. So we had a little conversation. I'm sorry?
To number 2 and number 3, the environmental.
Oh, yeah, sure. Number 2 and number 3, I think the idea here is that because we really haven't vetted this through staff and through common council in terms of how they would react and feel as it relates to, and how it would work to have additional input in the review process, that maybe that's something else that we might need to move on to a different time, to a second level of comment, or a second level. It seems like it's going to be hard to get that all resolved between now and the 24th.
Well, what we have done though is come up with an intermediate solution perhaps that would be appealing, which is to say, prior to the TRC meetings, as we submit the plans to police and fire and zoning and planning and engineering, we'll just include the Environmental Commission and the Historic Preservation Commission in the plan review prior to the TRC meeting.
I think they'd be thrilled with that.
And I think that is a good step to take to get these preliminary, set of comments and points to be made by both of those commissions. So that's a very simple thing for us to change in the DRO for right now.
Okay, so we,
Great.
yeah, so I think everyone would be in favor of that. I didn't realize it was that easy. I thought we would have to go do a little more legwork on that.
Well, I think at some point in time, if it comes to pass that the Environmental Commission is actually going to attend the TRC, or the Historic Preservation is going to attend the TRC, that's another step. But right now, we're going to get written comments. And I think what people don't really fully understand is the TRC meetings are really rather rare. We might only have 3, 4, 5 a year.
Oh, okay.
Because it's not for any permit application. It's not even necessarily for every subdivision application. It's really for site plan applications. When we don't get all that many of them.
So Tom, you and Krista can work on the language here on these 2 points. That'd be great. I think that will make both of those boards pleased. And I think it will be beneficial. Okay, great. Thanks, Krista. Great. Okay, so now we're down to breweries. This is Andy's favorite. As you can read, Tom, maybe just give us a recap of what we did, and then I'd like Amanda to kind of talk to us a little bit about what she's learned.
Sure. So
This assumes that this is something that we really want to dig into. We may just say, we don't want to spend time on this. Maybe we're not that excited about this brewery thing, but it became kind of an issue last meeting, and it seemed like there are all kinds of things. There's production, there's distribution, there's floor area, there's conditional uses, and we're kind of trying to figure out, reaching into a bowl of jello, what we really wanted here. And, we can shut this down and say we don't want them, or we can go on. So maybe what we'll do, Tom, is recap what we've done in the past, and then Amanda, you can kind of give us an idea of what's happening elsewhere in the state, and we can decide just how much we want to do on this particular topic.
Okay, so prior to the adoption of the DRO in December 2019, I think the city had adopted amendments to the CRBD allowing for a number of uses, including brewery uses. And so the issue that's come up is that there's a distinction in the state between what these different alcohol manufacturing uses actually are. And so a brewery use seems to be more of an industrial type use, and whereas food can be consumed on site, but they're not allowed to serve food. So it's not like the type of establishment where it's sort of a restaurant that also makes beer. It strictly makes beer, and you might be able to bring in an outside sandwich or something like that. And so the question is whether something that's a little more industrial in nature belongs in the CRBD versus something like a brew pub, which actually serves food. And maybe that's something, Amanda could touch on, the different distinctions, and whether or not those uses should be allowed at all in the CRBD. So that seems to be the issue, is whether or not one, the brewery use, the brew pub use, either of them should be permitted or none of them.
Both of them.
Essentially, it will come down to the ABC offers different kinds of licensure. So there is a restricted brewery license, which would be about a brew pub. And then there's also the limited brewery license, which is more like the distributor. Like they have in New Providence, I think it's called Untitled, and they have one in Chatham, I think something Elephant. Clearly, I don't go to these places very often, but it's going to depend a lot on what type of licensure the applicant is looking for, because the fees are very different. And even with the limited brewery license, where they can basically just make beer and then have tastings, if you will, the fees regulate how many barrels they can do a year. So they start at $1,250 for 50,000 barrels, and they range up to $7,500 for 300,000. So it's kind of a big range, and it would also depend what you really want to see. Like Tom said, if you're looking for a brew pub, that's one thing, but if you're looking for a larger distribution with the tasting and the sampling, that's a different thing. So there's not that many ordinances on point. I tried to find what other towns were doing, and I did find 2 or 3, and most of them do just limit floor area and the size generally. They tie it to parking, so that if you're going to have a huge place, then you should have a lot of parking. So that could be a limitation on a downtown type thing anyway. But we can always add conditions of approval too in the resolutions. Like we did have a case in one of our other towns where it was more of a distribution center, and we actually limited their hours of operation, when they can move their trucks, the kind of way that they move the kegs so that they don't make noise, because we had a lot of resident complaints about that. So I mean, we can, if it's something the board wants, we can figure out how to do it. It's just a matter of what the board wants.
Do we know what license the Bull and Bear?
Well, I thought that the question came up is what are they doing? And then somebody on the board at the last meeting was concerned that they would have the ability to make a lot of beer, and then there would be a lot of box trucks or whatever in that location.
Well, and
But
that's
it's not a bit.
right now,
Go ahead,
that's
Krista.
potential because we say breweries are permitted and breweries are a very broad range of, whatever, 15,
Right.
20, however many barrels with the tasting. But the potential is there for it to become out of control. And so the question is, do we want to just take out that use in the CRBD altogether now? And we know that we're going to have one, and that'll be a non-conforming use, and that's all we have. Do we want to make it a conditional use, or do we want to just create a maximum of some kind of measurement that's easy to understand and easy to realize? And therefore, if another tasting kind of brewery came along, we wouldn't object to it. If, when you have a change of use in the CRBD, it doesn't necessarily trigger any kind of board application. So, that's why Bull and Bear got a permit and is going to open one of these days.
A Bull and
So,
Bear.
but is Bull and Bear is
Go
it
ahead.
a brewery or is it a beer pub?
It's a brewery.
Because there's a distinction. It's
It's a
what?
brewery.
It's a brewery?
Yes, because it has that special kind of license that Amanda referred to.
So no food is
Right,
served
so-
there. No food served there.
No food served, no.
Right.
And
So
reconsumed.
I think the distinction is like the one in New Providence, Untied, is clearly a brewery. They're making a lot of beer, but they don't serve food. You can go, you can bring a pizza, you can bring whatever you want, and you can sit in there and you can eat and drink their beer, but they're also distributing beer. They're trying to get into restaurants. They're trying to get into certain places. And I don't think we want that in the downtown.
And that's in a
Um,
quasi-industrial location, right?
Can
Well,
I-
it is
I
an
would
industrial. The
recommend
other
looking-
tenant,
I'm sorry. I was gonna say, I would recommend looking at the Twin Elephant as probably more of a model for what they're trying to do here. And I would
but the
question,
Twin Elephants is the same though, because the Twin Elephants makes beer, but they don't serve food. It's not a brew pub.
but
You can
correct, but
bring
they
your own
don't,
food there.
they don't distribute. They don't, at least their goal currently is not to distribute.
Yeah.
And they only serve what they brew on premises, which I think might also be an important piece. One of the things, when you go to these places, if you think about the volume they can actually physically, realistically produce on site. I mean, some of them, if you go to them, you're required to sort of take a tour, I think is often one of the things they say in
Yeah.
order to be legal. A lot of them have an operation that looks ambitious for somebody's garage, but on a commercial basis is pretty nominal. And at what point do they get to the point where they can actually scale up to actually bottle and distribute or keg it, put it in kegs and distribute at the level, Andy, that you're thinking of?
Yeah, well, the elephant one is much smaller than the one in New Providence. The one in New Providence is actually in an industrial building. The other tenant is a big tire guy. They probably have about 20,000 feet, just guessing
Right.
off the top of my head at the
Yep.
New Providence one. The elephant one is maybe 5 or 6. It's a long, narrow space with a
Right.
couple of, fermenters and stuff. So, I mean, you're not putting in an industrial scale thing in a building in Summit. I mean, I don't know how big the fermenters are. I walked by it the other day. It's not a big shop, the Bull and Bear. But to your point, if they wanted to do nothing but sit there and crank out beer 24 hours a day, but I thought there was also the restrictions on the water use, the discharge of the waste and all of that. So
Okay.
I just don't know how much something like that's going to be able to make beer that we're going to have to worry about a massive distribution. But again, my opinion would be if a brewery like Untied, which is the New Providence one, wants to go into one of the quasi-industrial sections of our town, I don't think we should discourage that because we have industrial buildings that it would work in. But I don't think we want that in our downtown.
I would agree.
Andy, I don't think we can go off assumptions of, obviously you're speaking logically about what they can and can't do, but I think we still have to delineate guidelines and box it in.
Yeah,
because
well,
you
that's
just don't
what
know.
I'm saying. We
Okay.
have to, if we're going to do this, we have to make it clear that something of the scale of Untied is only in an industrial section, and something of the scale of a Bull and Bear or somebody wants to, you know, have a, whatever, a 2,000-3,000 foot little brewery and people come in and sit and eat, I don't think we should discourage that. I think that's, you know,
I think
something
we
that's,
need, I think we need to do some research as to what reasonable output is, either, you know, both for an industrial site and for something in town. What is a reasonable volume? Which I don't think we really have a handle on. I mean,
I guess the question that I have is, why would we even want to do that? I mean, you know, why do we need another one of those in downtown anyway? That's, you know, I'm making a personal statement. One is enough for me.
Well,
So
you
why
could say,
would,
how's the retail going to be 5
you
years from
want
now?
people to come, you want people to come into town, and if they're not going to, they want it.
how many breweries do you want in town? You want to, you know, 5 or 6 of those, or 8 or 10 of those? How many do you want?
Well, I don't think the market's going to bear for 8 or 10 of them,
All
but
right, okay, 3. 3 of them.
Sure,
yeah.
Okay with
I'd like
that.
that.
Yeah.
I frankly don't like that.
Yeah.
So that's my point of view.
Well, I mean, you know, we could
I
get
would
another
prefer it
Italian
would be-
restaurant too. We don't need that either, but.
Right. I mean, I would prefer if we had something like Untied, we had it in an industrial building and people would go there versus, but I don't think having 1 or 2 of them in town is a bad thing. I mean, craft breweries are, you know, on a big increase.
Oh,
So I
they're
don't think
hot.
we should
They're
limit
hot.
them.
I would much
Yeah.
prefer one that you can eat in as opposed to one that just you go take a, you know.
Well,
tour.
yes, that's
Right.
that's what I was saying.
Exactly.
The downtown ones should be ones where you bring your own food and they serving you their beer and they're not looking to distribute and they're not looking to get into Gary's Wine and Marketplace or whatever
Right.
retail shop. They're merely making enough that they're paying their rent, they're making money, and they're staying a small little craft brewery. And you can walk in there with sushi from Taco, or you could buy a takeout steak at the Summit House and sit down in there and drink their beer. On the other side of the coin is that we should not discourage if we have a vacant 7,000-8,000 foot industrial building and somebody wants to put a brewery in it. We shouldn't discourage that either.
Amanda, is the license that Andy was talking about with that place where they come and eat food, that there's a specific one just for that?
Yes, and it limits, they can only serve,
Yeah.
like someone said, that what they brew, and they can't have any outside food. They cannot coordinate with food trucks or any of that sort of, there's no food allowed except for, like, I think they have packaged snacks and bottled water maybe.
Oh, but you can't bring, you couldn't bring a taco from an, you
But you
couldn't
can
bring,
bring-
No, you can.
you can bring things in. Okay.
They can't sponsor food. They can't put in the paper, food truck night, barbecue, come to the back
Gotcha.
door and get barbecue.
Gotcha.
They can't do any of that, but you can bring your own, you can bring pizza, you can bring whatever you want, you can sit down and hang out
like-
there. Those are small operations.
It's like the
In the
Elks
downtown.
Club. It's like the Elks Club are going to have a cigar at Flores. You're bringing in the food.
Mhm.
So it seems like we
Is
have,
that license limit volume and those kinds of things? Or is Krista's idea about floor area wouldn't be needed to sort of limit?
The floor area, I think, would definitely be needed as well, only because it really depends on the size of the tanks. So if they have a lot of space, they can make a lot of beer. But if it's limited somewhat, then their tanks have to be smaller and they won't be able to produce as much. So they
I
can't.
think,
So
I
the
think that's
license
what
and
has to be regulated. I mean, there has to be
Well-
parameters around that.
So the license and the
Yes,
square
and-
footage could be a combination in the CRBD that would both allow for it, but keep it to a limited
Right.
size.
Yes, and that's why in the last meeting, I said, and Steve wrote the opinion for New Providence is, and he gave it to us when we interviewed them as one of his things, is they had to go and get a variance for how many people could sit or whatever. So that we should do that, and we should use that as an example, because if it's in the downtown and they want people to sit, they're going to have smaller fermenters, because they can't take up the whole area and have 5 people. You'll never survive.
Right.
You'll have to hope people walk in and just buy the beer as opposed to going into the wine store next door and picking up a 6-pack.
It is, but
So-
Andy, we still have to limit it. We still have to regulate it, because if you have a big space like the Meat House or that Playhouse next door where they've got room in the back, I mean, they could put out a volume.
Yes, I'm not saying we shouldn't regulate it, but we need to, we in the downtown, we definitely, if we're going to do this, we should regulate how big they are and all of that.
Well, with the
I
restricted.
agree.
Sorry.
go ahead,
Go
Amanda.
ahead.
With the restricted brewery license, the max that they can produce is 10,000 barrels of 31 gallons per year. So I don't really know what 10,000 barrels equates to in bottles of beer, but
That's 310,000 gallons if I did my math right, or is it 31,000 gallons? Let's see.
Well, it depends. It
I think
depends
it's
on the
the-
definition of it depends on the definition of a barrel. A barrel is a different size for bourbon, for wine. I mean,
Said it's 31 gallons in a barrel.
so 31 gallons in a
And it can
barrel.
produce 10,000 barrels.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's outrageous.
That's
10,000
a-
barrels is insane. It's insane. It's not on the scale of a CRBD. So
Can
here's the
you-
question I have. We have a CRBD that ordinance that we've revised. It was passed in December that allows breweries that are not very well defined. So what we want to do is define that in such a way that we can all live with. And then perhaps whether it relates to LI, do we adjust the LI zone perhaps to allow it? Or do we just say that anyone who wants to put in a brewery has to come before the planning board and make that request?
Well, Chairman Anderson, Krista's point about the floor area does contain what volume you could potentially produce. While your license allows you a certain amount, that your floor area would only still contain you. Is that right, Krista?
Yes.
And then it also makes
Yeah.
review from a zoning perspective very finite, that you'd have to have the license and that you would have a limited area where your square footage could be that would keep you from creating a certain volume.
So Bull and Bear, including the finished floor down in the basement, because it was always used for production when it was a bakery before, that counts as floor area. And essentially they have close to 4,000 square feet. So if you just picture, even if it was 4,000 square feet all on one floor, maybe, Elm, whatever, that design studio, Elm, West Elm, I don't
West
know
Elm.
what that is, but maybe, that's probably pretty big, about as big as anything in the downtown. How much do you want to encourage it? Do you want to say, okay, we had one, it was worth them to have 4,000 square feet, so maybe we don't mind another one at 4,000 square feet. So you could have the permitted use. Breweries, in the CRBD, we have a list of lots of different permitted uses. Breweries right now is one. You could just change it to say breweries of not more than 4,000 square foot floor area, or 5,000, or whatever number you thought was appropriate.
With license A.
Well, you would have to. I mean, that's like a foregone conclusion that you
Well, I
have.
guess the question is I'd like to see a number attached to that, not to exceed 2 or 3. Unintended consequences, drive-in banks, things happen that you don't intend with your ordinances. So, from my perspective, and I'm being a bit of a pain about this because it's sort of a bug in my, you don't hear this from me very often. It's not something I'm a big fan of. Let me just
I have
say.
a question. Could you make the restriction around how it's sold? Meaning, for example, they can only sell it to be consumed on site or not to be distributed beyond individual customers?
Their license would allow for distribution, so I'm not sure that we could restrict that further.
Okay.
If the state's allowing them to do it.
I have a question after Mr. Drummond. I don't know. Did you-
Hey, Chairman, if I may, I would say the more pubs we have, the better competition and the better beer.
Oh, that may be true. But the police department will have to have staff to pick up the drunkards on the street. That's the difference.
Maybe true as well.
Well,
People are going to drink regardless.
No
of-
one's stopping them from drinking.
yeah, I mean,
It's-
the restaurant, all the restaurants have licenses, and you
Yeah.
can bring all the liquor you want to a restaurant. So that,
So the number of
I-
liquor
I-
licenses are limited. There's not every restaurant doesn't have a liquor license. You know that.
listen, Bill, I think to your point, we do have too many drive-ins, and we limited that, and we limited how many
We limited
nail
after we
salons
had
could
too
be
many.
next to each. Yeah, so if you wanted to have a limit on the certain number, that's fine. I think the floor area ratio is a big limit in the downtown.
Yeah.
I wouldn't go more than 4,000 feet. I don't think we want anything as big as West Elm, because then you start getting into some real distribution. But I mean, listen, we have a lot of box trucks in town anyway. You got the trucks outside of on Zappia's and all that parked over there. So,
Did anyone see Jen's stat?
What?
Did anyone see Jen's stat?
A lot of beer.
110 glasses a day?
Oh, no.
So here we have a production question. We have a GRO that needs to be completed here at some point in time and passed on to council. and we have everything other than the breweries, I think, more or less resolved. And we have to work on the ORC 1/R10 thing that may prevent us from passing on the 24th, which case we'd have some time to study the brewery thing. The question is how do we get there? Do we ask Tom to do some research on this and to propose, given what he's heard today, a limit maybe on the number, on 4,000 square feet, on what types of distribution, so on and so forth, trucks, etc., working perhaps with Amanda, or how do we get from where we are today to putting it in DRO and passing it on to council?
Well, I have a question for Amanda. Is, legally speaking, is it easy or not so easy to say of a certain type of business, you're limited to the number?
Yeah, I may not be easy.
Yeah.
Number of gallons, you mean?
Establishments.
Number of that kind of business.
Oh, that's a hard.
That's
Well, to that point, I had a suggestion. I don't know if this is legal, but there used to be a prohibition against gas stations within, let's say, 1,500 feet of each other. That may apply here, so you don't end up with a block of, let's say, 3 of these types of uses. So you may not have one more, closer than 1,000 feet of another, and that would almost be a self-regulating way of, guaranteeing that you can only end up with 4 in the CRBD, if that is.
We already have that in
have that
town.
provision.
I think
we already have that.
Yeah, we
provision.
have that with the nail salons or something else.
Yeah,
So
right.
I think that's
So you can
a
apply
good
it.
way.
Potentially.
Why are you shaking your head, Krista?
Because we don't have that regulation. Oh, you mean we have a problem with too many of them?
I thought we had a regulation that how many nail salons could be in a row, and I thought we talked about it.
No.
What about the drive-in banks?
We didn't pass council.
What about drive-in banks, though? Drive-in banks, we have a limit, don't we, on the number of drive-in banks?
Well, we don't permit drive-through.
Okay. All right.
I'm
So
not sure how the liquor license process goes, because I know New Providence was a dry town and the council voted to approve a certain number of licenses. I'm not sure if there's already a certain number of licenses that have been issued or will be issued. I'm just not sure how that part of it works. I mean, maybe we could always just limit the number of licenses.
Well, we do have, of course, there are many different kinds of liquor licenses, as we've been discussing, but in terms of liquor licenses that you might think of, which would be a combination of restaurant with liquor service or just a liquor store. I don't know what the number is that we have in Summit, but they're all used. I don't think they're.
It's 1 for every 7,000, right? Is that right?
Well, I wouldn't think so, because that
Or
would.
1 for every 3,000 and we have 7?
We have
3,000.
My population, right?
whatever.
Don't towns also limit limousine license? I mean, similar to what you're talking about.
I don't think the limits
No?
are limited in terms of number, no.
Okay.
But the state, you get a liquor license, the state tells the town how many they can have, and whatever our number is, that's what we have. And so these breweries are another facet of a liquor license. And so, the discussion is, are we okay with a couple of more in the downtown? I think Tom's idea of limiting the how close you can be to another one, that's something that's commonly done. I don't know that the liquor license that limits the distance from a house of worship applies to the breweries. It applies to liquor stores, but it depends on who comes first, the liquor store or the house of worship.
I just looked it up. It's 1 license for every 3,000 people in your town.
So that would be roughly 7 or 8, but I believe we have more than that. So how that ever happened, I don't know, but the process of getting more is difficult.
Right.
I had one follow-up question, just so, eventually we will revise this part of the ordinance. I just wanted to be clear on the point of breweries versus brew pubs. What I thought I heard was that the board is more inclined to be in favor of breweries where there's a manufacturing component and you could bring your food in, versus the brew pub, which is more of the restaurant that makes beer. I just wanted to be clear on that point where we were headed.
Well, we're not going to have brew pubs, because that would mean we could only have one if somebody could buy a liquor license. from
Right.
something going
Okay,
up.
I see.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
For $1 million.
Well, that
Yeah.
explains it then. I'm sorry if I missed that part.
I think the distinction is we don't want a bigger one like Untied in the downtown, and we want to limit the square footage in the downtown so we don't have it, like, is Winberry's going out of business? If somebody doesn't put in a massive just, or something like that, into a big brewery into
Right.
there.
Yeah.
That's what I think we need to, if we're gonna do this, we need to limit the floor area ratio in the downtown.
I think there's a number of limits we need to put on it, frankly. And the question is, in my humble opinion, we spent way too much time on this thing for its value, but that's another story.
Well,
So the question is, how does it fit within the production of the DRO? Are we willing to hold up the DRO to deal with this brewery thing, or is it?
I mean, the only thing is right now they're permitted. So unless you do deal with it, you Anheuser-Busch could come tomorrow and put a brewery in the downtown.
That's right. And so I think that's something we probably need to resolve before we send it on to council, frankly, because we could end up with 400,000 cases.
So in my mind, I'm thinking that people are comfortable with X square feet and or distance from one to another.
Yeah.
Very easy to just insert not more than X in the list of uses that are permitted in the CRBD. But
Tom or Krista, can you give us the number, give us an idea of the square footage of some of the other restaurants in town? I have a hard time relating to West Elm. I mean, I know how big West Elm is. I need to have a feel for some of the other similar uses, I'll call them.
well, maybe you could think of, you've already said West Elm, you feel that would be too big. Maybe
Yes.
you just want to say, well, I think maybe where Del Duca Florist with that size would be okay, or that would be too big.
We've got like Ani Ramen, for example, or Blossom, the new restaurants, those are maybe the stuff that Jay's thinking about,
If Fiorino's was to not be a restaurant anymore and that was a brew pub and they wanted to make some beer in the back and you could all sit in the front and tables and bring your own food. Is that too big? Fiorino's is probably 3,000 feet, I'm guessing. I haven't been in the kitchen, but Paul, you probably got a good idea on that, right? It's about 3,000 feet.
I would say it's
like
less. I'd
that.
say it's probably like 2,000 at the most.
Well,
Yeah.
it's very easy.
That feels, I'm not talking about numbers, just in terms of size or scale.
Yeah.
That feels consistent with
Right.
with the rest of the city.
So I like
Not West Elm. West Elm is an exception to the rule, and that
No,
should not-
West Elm is too big. We don't want
Right.
a West
West
Elm
Elm's a
brewery.
former
Yeah,
movie theater. It's not a typical former.
So-
Yeah, exactly. That's why I don't want to be hearing about West Elm as the basis for this. It needs to be something
or
more.
a La Focaccia.
Yeah,
Right,
3,000
that's a
is
couple
better
of
than
thousand
4,000.
feet.
How about 3,000?
I was going for 2,500, Bill, but
All right, 2,500. I'll go 2,500.
I don't know if you can get enough people to sit with the equipment to make it financially viable if you're going to make it 2,500 feet. I think the Bull and the Bear one at 4,000 feet is probably
That's
the
probably
it's probably the max of what you want. And remember, some of that's basement space where you want, they have to have, the flour, the yeast, the bar, whatever the hell they're making there. They got to have storage. You can't just.
And is the production primarily in the basement there? I think it is, right?
The basement of Bull and Bear is where all the production is, and the
There you
basement
Yeah.
is actually bigger than what you see on the first floor.
So the basement's not considered FAR, though.
No, it is.
It is.
It is. It is.
All right.
Floor area is the finished space, whether it's in the basement or not.
Okay, all right. All right, so I'm back to my old question. Who's going to draft this thing and develop some alternatives for us?
Mr.
I'm not doing
Perella,
Huh?
Yes, sure.
Andy, you and Tom and Amanda and Krista are in charge.
I will buy you all the first beer
yay.
that's
Yeah.
made at the place, okay?
I'm there.
I can send out the ordinances that I thought were pretty good, and I can send you the restriction on limited breweries, because they do have limits as well to like number of events and things like that. So there are other restrictions on there as well. And then maybe we can work through that. I'll send you the Untied resolution too, because I know we have that.
And
Thanks.
there's also restrictions on like whether they can have TVs, what they can show. Like
Right.
the guy at Untied can have a TV, but he can't show the Super Bowl per the
I think that's
town.
because of licensing though.
Why is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I
Twin
mean,
Elephant
so,
has no TVs either.
Huh,
yeah, so,
I like no
Whatever.
TVs too.
why? Why?
Chairman, I think they're
Keeps
limited
you from
to,
loitering.
they're
Aside from the
limited,
beer.
Mr. Drummond,
thank you, Chairman. They're limited to 2 TVs of a certain size, so they don't become sports bars.
oh, I see.
right,
All right,
Right.
I got it.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Okay. All right, Andy, look, we,
Maybe Drummond should be on this committee too.
yeah.
Put them on there.
he's,
Yeah.
Greg is buying the second beer.
And like you pushed me on the tree, people, I don't think you want to push me on the beer, people.
All right, so Andy, you and Tom and Amanda and Krista are going to try to come up with something. Let's see what you can tell us maybe on Monday night, the 24th. I know that's not much time, but let's just see what thoughts you guys have in that. And then we got to make a determination after we just study the R10 stuff, which I'll work on tomorrow with Steve, as to what we can get in the 24th, sending on to council, or what we may have to just push it out one more month. But this was very helpful tonight. And then there's one more spreadsheet, and I know it's getting late, one more spreadsheet that Amanda put together for us. And Amanda, I think we sent this out, right? Chris
We did.
sent it out. But there are a couple of things in here that, like the first and second item on the spreadsheet had some questions. The brewery question, I think we've talked about, and the rest of it looks pretty much like it's something that Tom can deal with in terms of, tidying up, English, and grammar and things of that nature.
I would agree. If anyone's had a chance to go through it, we can discuss anything, but I think a lot of it was just clean up for the most part.
So on
And
the first 2 items, maybe just go over those quickly and let us know what your thinking is there.
Sure, what it is proposed to be will say that the use is actually commenced. What I've seen more frequently is that the construction will commence, only because say you're building a brewery and you have to do some kind of grading. Well, then the use won't commence very quickly, but if you start building, that will commence quickly. So that might be a change that we want to make, or just add both of it.
Well, I think it does kind of say that, but one thing to recognize is that what the ordinance says is you must get the construction permit within a year. Once you get the construction permit, the construction code says you must start the work within a year. So to say that you have to start the construction within a year is really contrary to the UCC, and would be very, very difficult for people, because sometimes, you have a little financial issue, you have seasonal factors, you have, it works now very well, not a problem.
We've given extensions, I know, a couple of times under certain cases, right?
Yes.
And let's keep that how it is then.
All right.
And then the second one was no subdivision or site plan involving any streets requiring additional right of way width shall be approved, was the language at the end. Whereas a lot of times we'll just do that as a condition of approval. If you need to give us a dedication, that's a condition of approval, versus we just won't even approve it.
What the ordinance says is unless. So the ordinance language is there notifying the applicant that they already are notified and know that the ordinance requirement is they have to dedicate it. If you take that out of the ordinance, then somebody on the board has to remember to say, oh, you have to give us this deed. The ordinance does require it. It says you can't approve it unless they do X.
But is that what we want to do?
Already
Like,
there.
stop the application versus approving it with a condition?
It would, yes, it would ultimately go in as a condition, but if you take out the language that's in there now, then there's no way that the applicant absolutely knows this is what they're gonna have to do, among other things.
Okay, if that's been working, then that's fine.
Totally, yeah.
And then you had some notes on the brewery there at the bottom of that first page, which I think we've talked about, but maybe you can just give us a second or two on that.
Right, just because the definition we had that may include warehousing and offsite distribution. So we might just want to take that out of the definition.
Okay.
If that's not, we don't want warehousing and offsite distribution for the most part.
That's correct. Okay, and then anything else on that list?
But that's in the downtown,
Yes,
right? That's not
Ah.
if it's in an industrial zone. So
So
we have to
So
have a
changing the
distinction.
definition, yeah.
Right, we need a distinction, because if we have a vacant 10,000-foot industrial building and somebody wants to put an Untied over there, then they're gonna need to have distribution and, right?
so we're looking at two zones that need to be adjusted, the CRBD zone / ordinance and the LI.
Yeah, okay.
And anything else there, Amanda, in the list?
Printed out that list. I didn't see what you're talking about the breweries, but on the bottom of the way I printed it out was the basis for fees to be charged by the city for inspection services. And then Amanda made a comment that she wasn't sure about the overtime. This pertains to when there's a site plan and a developer has posted inspection fees, they would be charged. Well, they charge at their own rates, but if for some reason they didn't know what rate they were going to be charging, they would be charged at the same rate as if the city was doing that inspection. So if somebody said, I need a nighttime inspection, if the city were doing that at night, there would be an overtime fee. We don't typically charge anything for inspection fees when the city does it, because it's all incorporated in their grading permit application.
Gotcha.
So-
Yeah, I was just saying that in that actual specific section of the MLUL, I didn't see any reference to overtime, so I was just a little bit concerned that we're saying it if it's not allowed, but if it's a rare occasion that would even happen, so be it.
Right.
Okay.
And Tom, anything else on that list that you think we should discuss from your perspective?
No, I think Amanda did a great job, and I think most of them are self-explanatory in terms of being typos or grammatical changes. So I think we can generally incorporate all of them.
I have a
As
comment
discussed.
about the very last one. This term, not to be used as spoil, SPOIL, that's an engineering term of art.
Oh,
which-
is it? I Googled it and I couldn't find anything, and I was like,
Well, I asked the engineers because I knew I had seen it that way before, and I wanted to make sure that my understanding was correct, which is, it really means you're developing something, you strip off the topsoil level, you put that aside. You don't take it off site, you use it again on the site when you're putting topsoil back, but you're not using it as fill. You're not using it for any other purpose other than to replace the topsoil that you removed, but you're not getting rid of it.
That's when you see all those mounds, when you go to a construction site and you see them make those mounds with the bulldozers. That's
Yep.
what that's for.
And it's called spoil.
Yeah.
It's called spoil.
I had no idea.
Or spoils? All right, so I think we've gotten through that. Thank you, Amanda, very much for everything. And certainly Krista and Chris and Tom, thank you guys for all your hard work. And thanks all the board members for hanging in there for 2.5 hours after the many hours we put in this thing. So we got 2 homework assignments. I'm going to work with Steve on the R10 and see what we can learn about that and see what it takes to get there. And then Andy's and his team are going to try to get as much information as they can for the 24th, and we'll report back on the
Yeah.
24th.
Does everybody have my cell phone number if they need to call me?
I do not, but we'll email
Because
you.
this is being recorded live,
Okay.
I would share it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's email.
Email. Yeah.
Yeah, Chris,
Yeah,
Chris Nicola can send it out.
Yep.
And I'll send,
If not, I'll be at Untied.
I'll send it to everyone the brewery. I'll send it to Chris to send everyone, so everyone has the same information. about the brewery.
By the way, we got to stop with the reply alls on the emails.
Yeah. That's right.
That's violating the public, whatever that Amanda said before,
Open Publics Meeting Act, yes.
Open Publics Meeting Act.
Yep.
So when Chris
No,
says,
actually,
can you make it on, when he says, can you make it on the 20th, just reply to Chris only.
Well, also Chris can be BCC everyone moving forward and then
Yep.
do it that way. Yep.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. You create a BCC list.
All right, well, thank you all very much. We really have, a couple of days before we have to meet again, but we'll see you on the 24th at 7:30.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a
All
good
right,
night.
Thank you.
Bye.